Thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope that we have found you well as you join this ACTE webinar titled Managing Perkins Funds During School Closures. I am Patrick Biggerstaff. I serve as a CTE director in Indianapolis and also as vice president representing the administrative division of ACTE. On behalf of ACTE, we would like to thank you for joining us today and also for your membership in our association. Today's session will last about 1 hour. We are asking that all participants remain muted throughout today's presentation. If you have questions, you are welcome to add them in the chat room, and we will try to get to them as time allows. If we are unable to do so, we will save that chat room and ask today's presenter to respond at a later date. We will post those responses along with the recorded webinar on ACTE's website. I'm privileged to introduce today's presenter. Sheara Krvaric is an attorney who focuses on federal education programs. She helps states, school districts, and other education-related organizations navigate federal laws to maximize the reach of their federal grants. Sheara co-founded Federal Education Group, a law and consulting firm, in 2009. Before that, she worked at a state educational agency as in-house counsel and at an education law firm. Sheara.
Great, thank you. I am going to put up our presentation today. Does that look good? Okay, great. So it is a real pleasure to be with all of you today. I hope everyone is healthy and well and staying sane. We are going to spend our time today going through some of the key things to think about when spending Perkins money in this changed world. We are going to be focusing on federal rules. So one thing I would like to say at the outset, I am going to talk about sort of where the U.S. Department of Education and related agencies stand right now. It is very possible that state departments of education, other state agencies, or even your own local policies will have something different to say about some of the issues we're talking about. So I will cover the federal stuff, but know what this looks like in your state may vary. It's important to know that what I am going to talk about today, if I can figure out, there we go. What I am going to talk about today is what we know as of now. Things are changing constantly. The U.S. Department of Education is putting out guidance as it's available. So please know that some of the things we talk about today could be subject to change. I will flag a couple areas that I think are likely going to have additional guidance. So we will keep an eye out for that additional guidance. Okay. So one of the questions that naturally comes up is how much flexibility does the U.S. Department of Education have over Perkins to modify requirements now that we're in a national state of emergency? As you probably already know, the department's flexibility is limited. There are some places in Perkins where the department can give leeway, and we're going to touch on those today. But for now, Ed does not really have authority to waive Perkins requirements. That could change coming down the road. Congress passed the CARES Act, which in addition to providing some funding to states, school districts, and other educational entities, including institutions of higher education, it has a provision in it that asks the U.S. Department of Education to report back to Congress in 30 days on the need for additional waiver authority, including authority for Perkins, in order to provide what Congress called limited flexibility. So Ed will be making that report soon, within 30 days of the CARES Act enactment, and so we'll be on the lookout for what the department asks for and what Congress gives. But for now, Ed does not have a ton of authority to change Perkins requirements. where there is some flexibility is when it comes to some of the administrative rules that come from the Federal Office of Management and Budget, but apply to Perkins funds and other federal funds. There is some flexibility. You have some links up here on this slide, and we are going to touch on what flexibility has already been granted, what flexibility might be in the works, but if you need these documents, you will have the links to them here. So here is our agenda for today. I want to spend a little bit of time talking through what you should be thinking about when spending current money. So money that you might have on hand now for sort of the rest of this year. What are the things we need to be thinking about when we're spending that money? We're gonna talk just very quickly about some practical things that might come up when drawing down funds, so asking for funds either from the U.S. Department of Education or from your state department. And then we're going to cover some of the administrative rules that apply to Perkins, and I will flag for you where flexibility has already been granted and where there might be some additional flexibility in the future. And then I will end talking about just a few other Perkins-related issues that are on our radar screen, particularly regarding maintenance of effort, which is a state requirement, and some flexibility around accountability. So I will start with spending considerations, and you can see here some of the topics we're going to be going through. This is a pretty dense set of materials to cover, so please do feel free to ask questions in the chat. If we have time at the end, we will do our best to get to as many of them as possible. So one of the first issues that has come up is whether it's okay to use Perkins funds to pay for salaries, even though schools are closed and programs have either come to a halt or slowed. And I am happy to say that the answer is yes. If a state or eligible local recipient has a policy of paying state and locally funded employees during a school closure, the U.S. Department of Education has said that it is okay to pay federally funded employees too. So a quick note, the department has put out some guidance. We'll go through what that guidance on the next slide. But the department confirmed this doesn't have to be some sort of formal pre-existing policy. This could be a policy that you put into place right now. What the department is looking for, though, is to make sure the situation they want to avoid is where we are not spending state and local dollars to pay salaries for state and local staff, but we're continuing to use federal dollars for federally funded staff, because the general rule when it comes to federal spending is that we have to have consistent policies across our funding sources. But if you are continuing to pay state and locally funded staff during a school closure, then it is okay to use Perkins funds, even if programs have come to a stop, even if work has slowed down. The department encourages, to the extent possible, staff should work on grant-related activities, but that may not be possible or possible to the same level. And so that is an area of clarification the department has provided. So you can see the first link here is sort of a hot off of the presses fact sheet that the U.S. Department of Education put out. It was released this month, and it is specific to the COVID-19 outbreak. So you can see their confirmation of what I just said here in question 1. But Ed, what Ed is saying now really builds on the department's really long-standing guidance in past national emergencies, either for when there were hurricanes or when we had the H1N1 virus. This has been a fairly long-standing policy, so you should feel comfortable relying on it. It is also based on a document the Office of Management and Budget put out, so this is really sort of a federal-wide clarification. The next question that we've gotten a lot is what to do if an activity has been canceled. Can you still use Perkins funds to pay for costs that might not be refundable? So, you know, what if you've already paid registration fees for a conference and you can't get them back? Or more likely, airfare, and you can't, and it was a non-refundable ticket and you can't get it back. And this could even potentially be contract-related costs, especially I'm thinking if maybe there were some assessments that you were planning planning on administer and you have a contract with your vendor, you can't do the assessment or you can't do it in the same form, what might that look like? So building off of some flexibility that the Federal Office of Management and Budget has extended to federal agencies, Ed has now said that it is okay. You can charge costs associated with canceled activities if we sort of do two things. So first, we have to try our best to negotiate with whomever you're paying to see if you cannot pay. So if it's a ticket, try to call the airline, see if they're offering any refunds, even though it was a non-refundable ticket, or if it was a conference, give the conference person a call and see if they'll refund. So first, try to get a refund if you can. The second thing is, if this is a contract cost, many times contracts have provisions built into them that sort of cancel the contract if there's been an emergency or an act of God. That contract provision may or may not cover the existing pandemic, but if it does, the department wants to see you try to take advantage of that first. So the first step is really to try to minimize any money you might owe. But if after going through those steps, there's still money to be paid out, the department has said it is okay to pay it. Now they caution, anything that we pay for canceled activities, we're not going to have available for activities we might want to do in the future. So it's always a balance, right? Because we don't know that there's necessarily going to be more money, Perkins money coming down the pipeline, but the flexibility to pay those things is there. It's on the fact sheet, which was linked to on the last slide. One important thing to always keep in mind about spending is that, if we are paying for a cost for a canceled event, we still have to make sure it related to an allowable activity, and we still have to make sure the cost is necessary and reasonable. So, if you had bought a first class ticket, probably can't pay for that now, but assuming we're otherwise an allowable use of funds, then it is okay to charge. Okay, so another thing to think about now is, what, now that sort of things have changed, and assuming we have money that we plan to spend that we can't spend the way we planned, or that we want to pivot our spending in light of the current emergency, what can we do to use our Perkins funds to sort of support instruction as it looks now, which obviously is largely online and may very well continue to be online next year. And Perkins, as you probably know, has a lot of spending options. So I've put just a few of them. These are state level activities, state leadership activities that a state could support, but there's professional development to support distance learning. There's supporting eligible recipients to eliminate inequities in student access, which could absolutely be a significant problem right now. We could think about how do we have to redevelop programs of study in places that are going to be really impacted by the fact that we're not holding in-person classes. Another thing here is to partner with qualified intermediaries. Now that things have moved online, there might be other organizations within our sphere that can help us to sort of stand up programs. I'm thinking about if you're working in a school district, institutions of higher education have had a sort of longer lead time to build up online learning infrastructure. And maybe they have classes already up and running that your CTE students could participate in that they weren't already participating in. So there might be ways, or there might be organizations to partner with that can help to sort of scale up some distance learning relevant to your Perkins programs. Making instructional content widely available. So that's a great thing for online educational resources and pushing it out to as many kids as possible. And then there's this broad other activities. So these are just a few. This is not everything. I just wanted to highlight a few things just to make sure we're thinking about all of the range of Perkins funding. If you are at the local entity, things that I pulled up, guidance counseling right now. That might be really important for high school kids who are trying to think about how all of this is going to affect what they do either post-secondary or career. So there's some room to have the Perkins dollars support that. Obviously professional development, adjusting curricula if needed. We can adjust our programs of study. acquiring the materials we need to actually do instruction online, expanding distance learning. And then, one thing that I want to focus on, since I think, we want to keep as close a lens as possible on equity considerations, is reducing out of pockets for our special populations to the extent that we can help get them up and running in what instruction looks like now. So these are just a few activities that I wanted to highlight. One question that has already come up is the question of timing. And that's because under Perkins, local entities only have 1 year to spend their money. So anything typically that remains unspent at the end of the year goes back to the state to be redistributed through the Perkins formula the next year, so to sort of redistributed out across the state. Currently, the U.S. Department of Education does not have authority to change that, but there is some small flexibility for states that you might want to think about. So what the law says is that local recipients have 1 academic year to spend their money, but the law doesn't define what academic year is. So that is some room for states to set their own definition. So if a state currently cuts spending off, let's say on June 30th, or even earlier at the end of school, there is some room for states to sort of say, well, for this year, given the disruption to educational programs, the academic year actually could extend through the summer, and maybe cut that deadline off, so before the state recaptures unspent funds, to try to give people an opportunity to repurpose that money. Now, that is going to depend on your state. That is going to depend on sort of needs, but that is something to think about if you're finding yourself with some unspent money and not sure how you're going to have time to spend it by the time you would normally spend before it gets recaptured. That's at least something to explore. Okay, so another issue that unfortunately we have to talk about when we talk about spending is our good friend supplement, not supplant. Supplement, not supplant is a requirement. It's in Perkins, and it says that we have to use Perkins money to sort of add CTE activities and not replace the state or local money we would otherwise spend on CTE. Ed has a long-standing policy of testing compliance with supplement, not supplant, by asking 3 questions, and they call these questions the 3 presumptions. So the first question is, are we spending Perkins money to pay for something that we have to do by some other law? So if state law requires us to do this activity, the department normally presumes that using Perkins funds would violate supplanting. The next one is, are we using Perkins dollars to pay for something we supported with state or local money last year? If so, the department will presume supplanting. And the third question is sort of, are we using Perkins funds to do something for CTE students that we're simultaneously doing for everyone else with state or local funds? And the department, there's a long background about whether or not this is actually a presumption that's appropriate to apply to Perkins, but it is something that OCTAE has applied, and so that's why I put it on the slide. So this feels like it's a limit on spending, but one thing I want to make sure everyone is aware of is that there is a long-standing U.S. Department of Education policy that OCTAE follows that says these presumptions can be overcome if, and you can see what it says on the slide, if the state or local recipient can demonstrate it would not have paid for the activity if Perkins funds weren't available. And this most often comes into play when we have declining state and local funds. And that is certainly probable right this minute, and certainly into next year and the years after. And what the department typically wants to see is sort of timely, contemporaneous, the documents that are present, current, to show that state and local money is going down, and that we would have had to cut an activity if there wasn't Perkins money to pick it up. So we're talking about sort of like budget and planning documents that show, hey, we are now in a new, we have to refocus our budget priorities given the COVID-19 emergency because state and local either money is going down or its demand is, we have to spend it on other things. And so we don't have the money to continue this activity. If you can sort of tell that story through contemporaneous records, then you can overcome a presumption of supplanting. And that's obviously particularly relevant for that second presumption. So that's just something to keep in mind. That is something ACTE has written into guidance. So that is something that is out there. Okay. So the next thing to think about is planning. So if a state or local recipient is going to change how it spends Perkins money this year, then it needs to update its plan and budget. And what that looks like is going to vary from state to state. But one thing we're encouraging states to consider is how can we streamline the process to make it as easy as possible for people to repurpose their Perkins dollars. Now, one thing I do just want to point out, you'll see on this last bullet, the Office of Management and Budget has authorized ED to sort of relax some of these planning and budget amendment processes. The department has not yet put out guidance on what that might look like. So for right now, we're still in a world where whatever your thresholds are for amending budget and plan, you still have to follow. But that could be an area of potential relief and something to look out for. Okay, for state plans, the department has already provided some relief for next year. So what I was talking about changing and amending plans, that's for the plans that exist right now. The department has put into place some flexibility for next year. So what is on this slide are the new deadlines for state plans, and on the next slide, I have the new deadlines for local applications. So on the state side, states had the option to submit a one-year plan for 1920 and then a four-year plan to cover the next 4 years. So if a state did the one-year plan and is now having to do the four-year plan, it was originally due today, April 15th, and the department has now extended that, and there are two options. If a state can submit by June 15th, then the department will do its best to review and approve it and just do awards as normal. So you would get your normal July 1st allocation and then the supplemental allocation on October 1st. If that can't happen, then you can submit by September 15th. And what will happen there is the department will essentially extend the transition plan so that it can award some money on July 1st, and it will wait to offer full approval until this September September submission is reviewed. So that's on the state side. On the local side, the states have a fair amount of discretion. So the normal rule is that local recipients have to submit an application in order to get funds. States have some discretion here over what that application looks like. The federal law has the federal law has a rule that says that the local application has to cover what's in Perkins in order to be fully approved. There are elements in Perkins that have to be addressed, but if a state can't address, so what a state, I'm sorry, my daughter is in the next room calling for my husband, so I am, rather than try to ignore her, I'm so sorry, this is working from home. I am just gonna let him know that he is needed. This is the reality of working from home. Okay, and then I can focus. I am so sorry. Okay, so typically local recipients have to submit an application that covers all of the things that are listed in the Perkins law. But states have an option to do something called substantially approvable. And that means that the state can say, okay, submit what you have, and we will sort of say you've submitted enough to start your program by July 1st. And each state gets to decide what enough might be, but it might be, rather than submitting the full application, it might be submitting a set of assurances and a light budget. But states have sort of flexibility to decide. And what happens is, if a district submits something that the state considers to be substantially approvable, then the local recipient can start its program, it can obligate its funds. And what obligate means is staff can start working, you can start entering into contracts, you can start planning activities and carrying out activities. We cannot draw down funds, so we can't get reimbursed or draw down funds in advance until the application is fully approved. But once you're able to draw down funds, you could reimburse yourself back to that substantially approvable date. So this is some flexibility if it's challenging to get a full application in time to be approved by July 1st, especially because there's still the needs assessment requirement. There is still some stakeholder engagement requirements. So if it will be a challenge to have a fully approved local application by July 1st, states can offer this sort of pathway where you get a partial application in, you get the substantially approvable status, and then you're good to go, at least to start your program, and you'll be able to reimburse yourself back. One clarification Octave gave for next year is they did confirm that all of that stakeholder engagement that has to happen around the local needs assessment and the plan does not have to happen in person. There's lots of ways that you could do it, either through virtual meetings or through written feedback. It doesn't have to be a formal sit-down process. So that is something to take into consideration as well. Okay. Drawing down funds. This is just a quick discussion for the states that are on this call. One thing to sort of think about now is having backup. So states get Perkins money from the U.S. Department of Education through a system called G5. And state employees have to be registered in the G5 system in order to draw down money and do the things in G5 that you need to do. It would be a good idea right now to plan for backup in case someone gets ill, or if because of technology from working at home, they can't access the system, having some redundancies to make sure that we don't have a lack of access to drawing down the funds. And the U.S. Department of Education is making it easier to add users. I've put a little notice that was up on their website. So if you are at the state level, that is something to think about to make sure drawdowns aren't interrupted. If you are a local recipient, the one thing the department has sort of recommended people keep in mind is that there are rules if a local recipient gets money from its state in advance, which states are sort of all over the map on whether or not they wait for you to spend your local dollars first and then they reimburse you, or whether they let you draw down money in advance. But if you are permitted to draw down money in advance, then you can only draw down as much as you need to sort of pay out immediate costs. So if you are someone who is getting money in advance from the state, we don't want to be asking for money to sort of have a cash reserve. We're not allowed to keep federal cash on hand. So we're only asking for advances when we need them, and we're minimizing the amount of time between when we get the payment and when we pay it out. So those are just a few things to think about around disbursements. What I'm going to move to now are administrative requirements. So you may know that there is a set of regulations that are put out by the Federal Office of Management and Budget that involve administrative requirements, everything from contracting requirements to inventory management. And as a general rule, those regulations are still in effect. We still need to follow them. So we still need to make sure that costs are necessary and reasonable. We still need to take steps to document spending, but OMB has authorized the department to offer relief in some areas. So as we've already talked about, there are 2 areas where the department has already offered relief, And the first is paying salaries during school closures, even if programs have stopped or slowed. And the second is paying for canceled events. So that is clarification, flexibility that the U.S. Department of Education has already put out. You will see on the slide some other areas where Ed is authorized to offer relief. We expect them to offer that relief, but they haven't done so yet. And that will be around, well, application deadlines, they've offered some relief, but prior approval requirements, we're gonna touch on that. Certain procurement requirements, including like the need to buy local, reporting deadlines, indirect cost rate submissions, and importantly, single audit deadlines. So keep an eye out for those because they may be in the works. The other thing to note, though, is that the U.S. Department of Education does have some authority to offer additional exceptions to uniform grant guidance requirements on a case-by-case basis. Now, this is something you would have to ask for. You'd have to explain what the requirement is and why you might need relief from it in light of COVID-19, maybe time and effort, whatever. It is at least an option. As far as I know, the department has never actually done this, but we've never been in these circumstances before. So just keep in mind that that's an option if there's some administrative requirement that's just really hard to get around right now. Just know that there is a potential for getting an exception from the department. So I mentioned time and effort, and I do just want to flag that those rules continue to apply. And just briefly, time and effort is the requirement that if you are paid with Perkins dollars or any federal dollars, there is some sort of documentation to verify that you worked on the federal program and that the amount you were paid is sort of proportional to the work you did. So if you were paid 100% with Perkins dollars, we would expect to see records that show that you spent 100% of your time on Perkins activities. If you split your time between Perkins and something else, we would want to see that your salary is split between Perkins and something else. So unfortunately, time and effort still applies. So even if we're working at home, we still have to have these records. But I do just want to flag that time and effort rules changed back in 2014 to permit more options for documentation. So it used to be that we had to keep very specific kinds of employee certifications, either monthly or every 6 months, depending on our situation, and it was something that we officially signed. The Office of Management and Budget changed those rules so that employee certifications is one way you can document time and effort. So if that's what you're doing and that works for you, that's fine. But there are other options as long as the records meet the criteria that are on this slide. So if your current system is hard to manage in light of distant work, just know that there are other options and that might be something to consider. Okay. Another thing to consider is inventory management rules. And just to flag that those do continue to apply. So if you are shifting your dollars to purchasing things like devices for students or acquiring instructional materials or something like that, we do need a strategy for managing them. Now, of course, these rules need not be a reason to not spend on our needs. Like if our needs are on acquiring items, we should do that. We just need to come up with a strategy of what inventory management looks like if we can't follow our normal process. One thing before I sort of get into what these inventory management rules look like, I do just want to make sure that everyone on the call has seen that the U.S. Department of Education has authorized Perkins programs to donate medical supplies that were bought with Perkins funds or 3D printers or things like that. Even if they were bought with Perkins funds, there is a list of entities, either or not-for-profits, that can be donated even though it was federally acquired. So that is an option if you have that on hand and you want to donate it. So there are really sort of two categories of things we might be buying with Perkins funds. The first is equipment. I would imagine a good chunk of equipment might be slowing down right now since we're not sort of like, on hand working the equipment, but if we're purchasing equipment, which is, you'll see here, the federal definition is 5,000, but remember that a state or your own organization might set a lower threshold. Usually to buy equipment, we need prior approval. So that might be asking for it in your budget that the state approves. It might be a more formal prior approval depending on how your state manages it. That is something that Ed could give an exception for. They haven't yet, but that's something to keep in mind, that if we do suddenly have demand for 3D printers and it's something you want to buy and it qualifies as equipment, there might be some relief on the need to get prior approval. So that's just something to keep an eye out on. Now, if we do buy such equipment, we need a strategy for meeting federal tracking requirements. And I bet most of your organizations have a strategy that involves tagging things, and maybe we can't do that anymore because maybe things are more remote, or we don't have access to the same level of staff, and that's okay. We just need to make sure we are keeping some kind of record of what we buy and what's being done with it. But the records, you can see here what the records have to include, but if it looks different from what you do normally, but it meets these standards, that's okay. So I just want to flag this because I want this to not be a reason why we're afraid to buy things we need. We do need to account for them. We do need to take care of them. But there are, lots of options for doing the records, and we just have to meet these requirements. Similar with supplies. Items that cost less than $5,000, keeping in mind that that's the federal threshold. Supply items don't formally have to be tracked the same way equipment does under the federal rules. A state might set a policy, or you might set a policy, but we do have to have adequate controls to make sure that the items are being used by the Perkins program. That's going to be harder to do now than it was, right? Because we're sending things out potentially for distance learning. They're not in-house. But that is okay, because remember, the general rule for internal controls is that the level of control needs to be reasonable for the situation we're in. So certainly we can't just buy Perkins equipment and just send it out into the world. We're still buying this equipment for the Perkins program and doing our best to protect it. While, if a student is using it in their home, we're doing our best. But it doesn't have to be perfect to qualify as a reasonable system of internal controls in light of the system we have now. So we want to think about what are the strategies we can develop, what makes sense, what are best practices to make sure that we can meet these criteria. But we do want to make sure that we have the ability to spend on our needs as our needs come up. Okay. Before I open it up for questions, there are just two other things I want to flag. So the first is for any state participants that are on the call. States are required under Perkins to maintain effort, so maintain a certain level of spending on career and technical education from year to year. This is the one area that the U.S. Department of Education actually does have authority to waive in Perkins. They have authority to waive maintenance of effort in exceptional or uncontrollable circumstances. There is some precedent for considering a pandemic to be an exceptional or uncontrollable circumstance. They did that in H1N1. For now, the department has not really signaled that it's expecting a wave of maintenance of effort, but I think as the economic picture catches up, people are gonna, the department will be more open to that, and we may even see relief from Congress. So if you're at the state level, please know that that waiver is an option and definitely something to start thinking about if that's a need in your state. The other thing is around accountability. And there is something in Perkins. The OCTAE actually just this week, confirmed that yes, in fact, this is in Perkins, but a state can revise its state-determined levels of performance if unanticipated circumstances arise in the state. So that is certainly, we are in an unanticipated circumstance, and we can imagine that these long-term school shutdowns are going to affect students and their performance. And so this is an area where states will have some flexibility, and that is spelled out in Perkins, and I expect we will hear more from the department as time goes on this. So, Patrick, that is all of the materials that I was going to cover. I am happy to take some questions if there are any.
Yes, ma'am. There are a few in the chat room. One had asked you to repeat what you said about donating, and I know that Melissa had shared a link in the chat room regarding donation or loan of PPE and other medical supplies. But if you have any more comments, or if you could just repeat the gist of your comments regarding donating, that would be appreciated.
Yeah, that's great. So the U.S. Department of Education has put out an announcement saying that if you have Perkins funded medical supplies, personal protective equipment, or 3D printers, even though it was purchased with Perkins funds, the department is giving permission to donate that to hospitals, not-for-profits. I think there's a list of entities that you're allowed to donate to if you have it on hand and you don't need it. They've said go ahead and donate it. There's no reimbursement owed back to the U.S. Department of Education.
Thank you. There's a question, this may be about time and effort. Are staff members required to document daily work tasks completed during school closures?
It's a great question. So that does seem to be time and effort. There's never been a requirement to document sort of daily activities. You know, for places that use employee certifications, usually that's something that you would do either every month or every 6 months, and you would just certify, say, I certify that I spent 100% of my time on Perkins related activities. If you have some other process, like if you have time and effort built into your payroll system, you could do that. So no need to do minute by minute. You know, I think it would just be documenting that you do work on Perkins, and if you're splitting time, noting that too. You know, it is okay if during a school closure, this is where some of that earlier guidance we talked about will come in. It is possible that somebody is working remotely and actually they used to be working full-time on Perkins. They're not working full-time on Perkins anymore. That's okay if your hours have been reduced, you know, and you used to work 40 hours and now there's only, like, let's say 10 hours of Perkins work. Even if we're using Perkins to pay your salary, the department said that's okay if the reduction is because of the school closure. So it doesn't have to be sort of a daily breakdown, but it would just be a certification that says all of the work that I did was related to Perkins. And if there is work that you're doing that is unrelated to Perkins, you're paying attention to what that split is.
Thank you. Forgive me if I backtrack a little bit from time to time. I'm taking these questions in the order they came in. So the next one you may have already answered. Will it be possible to carry over Perkins dollars?
Yeah, so that is the area that it's hard. Now, in the CARES Act, there is some authority for the department to extend the spending period. As far as I know, into like the total spending period, the amount of time the state as a whole has to spend it. As far as I know, Ed hasn't done that for Perkins yet. They have done it for certain elementary and secondary education act funds. So keep an eye on that. But the more specific question on carryover, unfortunately, right now, the department does not have authority to extend the carryover limit. The flexibility that does exist is at the state level. So the carryover rule is that any money that a local recipient doesn't spend by the end of the academic year gets rolled back up to the state for redistribution. And states do have just a smidge of flexibility to define what academic year is. So, you know, it is conceivable that a state might say, given the large-scale disruption for this year, we're defining academic year to go through the summer. So there could be some flexibility there. The other thing to look out for is that Congress did ask the department to report on areas where additional waiver authority might be helpful. And so if this is an issue, this is something to start bubbling up to Ed and say, hey, we really want you guys to ask for waiver authority of this cap on carryover so that we can have more time to spend our money.
Okay, what would recording look like in a situation where a non-refundable airline ticket will not be refunded but can be used at a date after the grant period?
This is such a good question, and one we've been grappling with. Other situations we've seen where the refund is like personal to the employee and not going back to the organization. I don't have a lot of good advice on that. You know, if you get a, yeah, I mean, let me hold that for one that I answer afterwards as a follow-up. I just want to think that one through.
Got it. Can we use the funds to pay for Chromebooks or other technologies purchased to support CTE students during distance learning?
Yes, that should be an allowable use of funds. When I assume we're asking at the local entity level, and purchasing equipment, you know, supply, device, instructional materials, content related to CTE programs is an allowable use of funds. So yeah, that should be something that's allowable.
Okay. If I understand correctly, this may be a state decision, but the question was, is there flexibility in allowing an extension to expend funds if the supply chain for approved equipment has been slowed down and we are unable to receive equipment in a timely manner?
Yes, so I do think that's probably going to be a little bit of interaction with state policy. Typically, the federal rule on cutoffs is that, and I want to go back. I want to go back and look at the Perkins language, but usually there is some flexibility if you've done the purchase order, but you haven't actually gotten the piece of equipment yet, that obligation sort of puts a hold and that doesn't get swept back up. But a lot of it is going to probably depend on your state policies, but there might be some flexibility there for prepayments that will come for future. So there could be some flexibility around that. Yep.
All right, the next question reads, how do we know if our state took advantage of the uncontrollable circumstances in the past, and how much could a state cut from their MOE?
How would you know? I guess you would have to ask the state. As far as I know, the department doesn't have those waivers up on its website, but it's been a while since I checked. So you would probably want to check with your state. There is no limit in the federal law to how much a state can cut, but the way Perkins is written now, if the department grants a waiver, it's only a one-year waiver and it doesn't reset the maintenance of effort target. So for example, if we reduce spending by 20 million, that doesn't reduce our target for the year after the waiver. The MOE target for the year after the waiver is what we should have spent the year we got the waiver. Now, that is something Congress could modify in light of the potential, unfortunately, long-term economic disruption, but that's something that states will need to think about when cutting and when asking for waivers, is that right now, that one-year cut doesn't carry forward into future years. You'll still have to spend at the higher level in future years.
Okay. Rather than donating equipment, is it permissible for school districts to use 3D printers and filament purchased by Perkins to make PPE masks for local medical professionals?
I certainly think some of that is just going to depend on state policy and how the program is run. But to me, that if you have an existing program of study that involves that and students are learning that, that feels like a really good adaptation to the curriculum, which is an allowable use of Perkins funds to sort of adapt the program of study, and kids would be getting a lot of good learning. So that feels like that fits within an allowable use of funds to me. Obviously, it would be up to the state to give the formal yay or nay, and it's going to depend a little bit on how it's structured. But yeah, and then the items produced with Perkins funds being donated seems to fit within the secretary's announcement that we can donate sort of Perkins funded materials.
Thank you. Should we move forward with purchasing equipment if the intent is not to use it for e-learning, but to have it in place for when classes resume?
That's such a good question, and I don't have a firm yes or no. What I will say is, any expense purchased with Perkins funds has to be reasonable, and the idea is that it benefit the Perkins program. So if you're planning for next year, it is conceivable to me that we will be in classes for at least some time. So if that is a need and if it is a reasonable use of funds in light of all of your other needs, then it does seem to, it is plausible that we will be back in schools at least for pockets of time for next year. And so planning for that time does seem reasonable. But obviously that's going to depend on your unique circumstances and what's going on in your state and how likely it is that schools will be open next year.
If we extend our year, and year is in quotes, if we extend our year, do we have to submit a new state plan, or can this be done within the context of the current plan, which has already been submitted?
So I might need more information about that, but if I read the question to be, if a state sort of takes advantage of that academic year language in Perkins to not sweep unspent money back now, but to sweep it back later, then yes, you could basically say, you could sort of extend the local application and say the application, you will be spending that money consistent with your existing approved application. And that seems consistent with what the department said about sort of extending plans.
Do you have any information on how on-site reviews will be handled with buildings being closed?
So if this is a question about U.S. Department of Education monitoring, my understanding, at least on the elementary and secondary education side, is that they have gone ahead with some of that virtually. They've asked for documentation, but that information I have is from a couple of weeks ago, so I don't know if they've paused now. Obviously, accountability has to move on, the world has to move on, monitoring will move on, but over the years, at various points in time and for various reasons, the department has taken a pause in monitoring. So it does seem reasonable, if things are hectic right now, to try to negotiate either with your state, if it's the state that's doing the monitoring, or with the U.S. Department of Education that's doing the monitoring, to maybe get some extra time if things are just sort of chaotic right now. But my understanding is, if monitoring can be done virtually, the department has expressed an interest in going ahead, but I think it is okay if you need more time to ask for more time.
Are there limits on the types of professional development that Perkins money can be applied to? Specifically, they're asking about executive level district staff receiving training around equity.
That is a good question that I will need to think about and answer as a follow-up. I mean, the professional development language in Perkins is pretty broad. It's not just teachers. So it does cover staff, but I would want to think about it, and clearly there would need to be a connection back to equity in Perkins programs. If it's a broader discussion on equity across all programs, maybe we could think about Perkins paying a share, but we would need to see some benefit back to the program. But let me take a look at that in more depth so I can be a little bit more cogent.
Okay, last question. Could a state decide to provide no maintenance of effort for a 1-year period given the uncontrollable circumstances?
Yeah, so the state does have the option to ask Ed to waive that. And that is something we don't need to wait for Congress for. That is a flexibility that exists in the Perkins law right now. So if a state has data, now one thing just to say, and you know, we always regret the things we say in the moment. Some Ed officials have said that they don't yet see the economic impact and they don't yet understand the rationale for maintenance of effort waivers. But if you have it, by all means, put it in front of them. Now, they were speaking under a different maintenance of effort provision not related to Perkins, but you know, you might have to paint the story of what the reduction looks like. But that is flexibility that exists on the table right now. You can ask for that today.
Okay, I'm going to add one more bonus question because it came in. Can you provide any more guidance on how to hold advisory meetings virtually? How should they collect responses from folks? Do you have any ideas?
I don't, and that might be something maybe ACTE wants to weigh in on at some point, just in terms of what best practices look like. You know, the department did put out an FAQ document earlier this week. I didn't put the link in the slides, but I'm sure ACT can push it out, just reconfirming that the stakeholder input doesn't have to be, you know, virtual. I think there's a tendency when we have meetings to want to have like physical pieces of paper, like an agenda or the sign-in sheets. I think if you do a virtual meeting, there are probably electronic records that will show who participated. Somebody can be a note keeper to sort of record what went in. So I think the department, I expect that the department's going to be flexible around documentation in light of the really unique circumstances we're all in.
Okay, that wraps up our questions. I would like to thank today's presenter, Sheara Krvaric of Federal Education Group, for sharing her insights. Also, I'd like to thank Lauren Philibrown for technical management of today's webinar. Thank you all on behalf of ACTE for your membership and the great work that you do every day. We are proud to partner with you in strengthening career and technical education. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.